All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Mindgasms. I'm going to do part 7 of a Mindgasms vlog today on the book The History of Sexuality, part 1 by Michel Foucault. He did what is called historiography in many of his books that are often put into the category of philosophy. Historiography is basically the history of ideas, concepts, and perspectives. In Discipline and Punish, which I made a video about a while ago, I'll add a link for that somewhere in the video in the description for this. Foucault writes about the history of cultural attitudes and behavior toward criminals. In Madness and Civilization, which I will make a video or write a blog about later, Foucault talks about the history of cultural attitudes and behavior toward people with mental disorders. In all of the handful or so of his books that I've read, Foucault seems to analyze how these cultural attitudes have changed from approximately the 1600s to the 1800s and through to today. He also uses a multi-factoral analysis. He explains the contributing causes that led to behaviors and attitudes changing from many different angles. There are a lot of reasons that attitudes towards certain groups of people and behaviors change throughout history. So, as you can see from the title, this is video 7 in this, and it's basically about how the Enlightenment, how science institutions of leaders of religious and scientific institutions during the Enlightenment used their power to convey their arbitrarily invented knowledge through discourse, that people in these categories, pedophiles, hermaphrodites, homosexuals, and bisexuals, and anyone who had anal sex, even straight people, were sinful, medically, and psychologically flawed. Okay, so this is what Foucault says about discourse, power, and knowledge. Quote, "What is said about sex must not be analyzed simply as the surface of projection of these power mechanisms. Indeed, it is in discourse that power and knowledge are joined together. And for this very reason, we must conceive discourse as a series of discontinuous segments whose tactical function is neither uniform nor stable. To be more precise, we must not imagine a world of discourse divided between accepted discourse and excluded discourse, or between the dominant discourse and the dominated one, but as a multiplicity of discursive elements that can come into play in various strategies." End quote. And then I'm moving a little further along in the paragraph here. Quote, "that it comprises, with the variance and different effects, according to who is speaking, his position of power, the institutional context in which he happens to be situated, along with that it implies, according to, it comprises with the variance and different effects, according to who is speaking, his position of power, the institutional context in which he happens to be situated, that it implies." End quote. And then moving a little further on along again here, quote, "discourses are not once and for all subservient to power or raised up against it any more than silences are. We must make allowances for the complex and unstable process whereby discourse can be both an instrument and an effect of power, but also a hindrance, a stumbling block, a point of resistance, and a starting point for an opposing strategy. Discourse transmits and produces power. It reinforces it, but also undermines and exposes it, renders it fragile, and makes it possible to thwart it. In like manner, science and secrecy are a shelter for power, anchoring its prohibitions, but they also loosen its holds and provide for relatively obscure areas of tolerance." End quote. So, Foucault clarifies that he is not saying that sex is is nothing more than an expression of power relations. He argues that knowledge and power are conveyed through discourse, but it's not as simple as that discourse is controlled by power. The latter is a series of unstable and separate parts. Foucault also underscores his claim that he is not simply setting up a binary here. He doesn't want to put discourse into categories like quote-unquote acceptable and dismissed, or quote-unquote dominant and subservient. This is a clear example of how he is explicitly disagreeing with the type of dichotomous narrative of boxes built by Marxists. Contrary to the belief by public intellectuals like Jordan Peterson that thinkers like Foucault are quote-unquote postmodern neo-Marxists. Foucault says that discourse and power are multi-factorial, which makes total sense, right? These factors change according to who is talking, how much power they have, and the relevant institutional context. Discourse is not controlled by or fighting against power. This part is important because, again, public intellectuals strawman Foucault all the time by claiming that he argues that knowledge and language are slaves to power. He is explicitly against that in this passage. Discourse can be a tool and a consequence of power, but it can also be a roadblock against it and a starting place for a disconfirming theory. It conveys, emits, and strengthens power. However, it also pokes holes in it, reveals it to be false, weakens it, and makes it possible to defeat. Similarly, silence and clandestine activities conceal and harbor power, but they also reduce its force and create small areas of flexibility. The first example that Foucault uses to illustrate this is sodomy, or anal sex. He also discusses pederasty, or pedophilia, hermaphroditism, perversions, and homosexuality. Quote, consider for the example the history of what was once, quote, the great sin against nature, the extreme discretion of the text dealing with sodomy, that utterly confused category, and in the nearly universal reticence in talking about it made possible a twofold operation. On the one hand, there was an extreme severity. Punishment by fire was meted out well into the 18th century without there being any substantial protest expressed before the middle of the century. And on the other hand, a tolerance that must have been widespread, which one can deduce indirectly from the infrequency of judicial sentences, and which one glimpses more directly through certain statements concerning societies of men that were thought to exist in the army or in the courts. There's no question that the appearance in 19th century psychiatry, jurisprudence, and a literature of whole series of discourses on the species and subspecies of homosexuality, inversion, pederasty, and quote-unquote psychic hermaphroditism made possible a strong advance of social controls into this area of quote-unquote perversity, but it also made possible the formation of a quote-unquote reverse discourse. Homosexuality began to speak in its own behalf, to demand that its legitimacy or quote-unquote naturality be acknowledged, often in the same vocabulary, using the same categories by which it was medically disqualified. There is not, on the one side, a discourse of power, and opposite it, another discourse that runs counter to it. Discourses are tactical elements or blocks operating in the field of force relations. There can exist different and even contradictory discourses within the same strategy. They can, on the contrary, circulate without changing their form from one strategy to another opposing strategy. We must not expect the discourses on sex to tell us, above all, what strategy they derive from, or what moral divisions they accompany, or what ideology, dominant or dominated, they represent. Rather, we must question them on the two levels of their tactical productivity, what reciprocal effects of power and knowledge they ensure, and their strategical integration, what conjunction and what force relationship make their utilization necessary in a given episode of the various confrontations that occur. End quote. Okay, so Foucault starts the previous paragraph by examining the example of sodomy or anal sex in terms of how power impacts discourse and vice versa. Sodomy was seen as the great sin of nature. Religious and scientific institutions during the Enlightenment categorized it as an unnatural sin and a medical flaw. The pleasure that some people choose by gay men having anal sex or straight or bisexual people fucking each other in the butt rather than the vagina was evil, crazy, and a psychiatric disorder. And I bet that specifically heterosexual people enjoying anal sex was probably not even contemplated. And I bet that most religious and scientific people in society, at the very least, would likely have been unbelievably appalled that many people do this today. This led to two opposing societal responses, but they were not binaries. It seems like Foucault is saying that they existed on a spectrum, with one reaction on one extreme end and the opposite on the other. The most severe punishment was people literally getting burned alive for sodomy, even if they were not necessarily gay, because this was deemed to be homosexual and thus sinful behavior. There was no substantial public protest against this until the middle of the 1700s. The response at the opposite end of the spectrum was secret, widespread tolerance of gay people having anal sex. This is because many people are homosexual. I've heard that 10% of the general population are, and I don't know if this is totally true, but regardless of what the number is, many, many people are gay, even though most of us are straight. Legal sentences against this were apparently very rare, and this should have happened much more frequently if everyone obeyed the legal, social, and religious order to do with these issues at the time. Foucault also mentions societies of men in armies or courts. I'm not sure what exactly he means by that, but maybe it has to do with rumors or stories that a lot of us have heard about some guys being secretly gay in the military. I have heard before that this was prominent in the history of armies going all the way back to ancient Greece, including even men openly having sex with young boys. I don't know anything about supposed groups of secret gay men involved with law or the courts. However, it wouldn't surprise me at all if that were a common thing during the 1600s to the 1800s, all the way up until today. In the 1800s, psychiatrists, lawmakers, scientists, and priests created a whole field of supposed knowledge by categorizing what they declared as different types of gay behavior. This included inversion, which was defined as a reversal of stereotypical gender traits, or men being more feminine. Other quote-unquote perversions were pederasty, or basically pedophilia, and quote-unquote psychic hermaphroditism. The latter was the earlier label for bisexuality, based on the belief that these people had both male and female characteristics in their brains. Leaders of the religious, scientific, legal, and social orders in the 19th century used their power to convey this totally invented so-called knowledge through their discourse and the academic literature that they wrote. This led to many authoritarian social controls. One good example of this a little later on in history is Alan Turing, who invented the Turing machine, which is a precursor to the modern computer, of course, right? He also came up with the Turing test for helping us decide whether an AI in the future can pass as human, and was crucial in breaking the Nazis' Enigma code in World War II, which played a major role in allowing the Allies to win, of course, right? He was prosecuted in the UK in 1952 for homosexuality and accepted chemical castration as an alternative to prison. He died from cyanide poisoning. It was originally declared to be a suicide, but he could have also been accidentally poisoned. If he did kill himself, though, it almost certainly had a lot to do with the totally undeserved chemical castration, to say the fucking least. Turing was far from the only person who suffered this unjustified punishment for his natural sexuality, over which he had no control whatsoever. This also was one of many different types of legal, let alone social, consequences of being gay. It wasn't even the harshest punishment either. Remember, as Foucault said before, people were literally burned to death for it. However, that discourse on the opposite end of the spectrum began to form as well. People use their power to convey their own knowledge of homosexuality, bisexuality, pedophilia, and other so-called perversions as completely natural. By the way, it's important to mention here that, contrary to popular belief, Foucault was not apologizing for or justifying pedophilia. This is another stupid point that dumbass intellectuals like Stephen Hicks and Jordan Peterson completely invent by never reading Foucault's writing in context. He was simply explaining what was happening and what people were doing, intellectual analysis. Anyway, those who supported unusual sexuality rejected the artificial categories of psychiatrists and scientists that painted these people as medically flawed. Another way that people use discourse to take power back in the form of language is, and I'm going to say the N-word here, a white guy saying it, so hopefully my channel doesn't get banned, but an example of people using discourse to take power back in the form of language is black rappers adopting the word nigga as a term of endearment or as a word for just black people in general. As everyone knows, this has spread to black popular culture and has reversed the power of that word. White people, of course, used to refer to black people as Negroes or niggers. Now, not only have we decided as a society that these are incredibly racist and prohibited terms, I could even get banned for using the word as a way to explain that people were referred to in that way. But only black people can say them now, giving them more power through discourse than their original oppressors. The tyrannical words have become words of power and privilege in the formerly oppressed people. At least in this sense, black people have used discourse to take some of the power back that was taken away from them in the first place. Foucault goes on to clarify and explain that, again, that he is not setting up a binary here. So he does this over and over again, yet dumbass public intellectuals insist that he is always setting up binaries, which he explicitly does not do over and over again. Anyway, two opposing discourses can exist simultaneously, fighting against each other and always changing without being able to be defined to the letter. There is not a narrative of power on one end of the spectrum and one fighting against it on the opposite side. Topics of conversation are strategies that work within a multi-factorial and interconnected system. There can be different and even opposing discourses within the same narrative. They can move to and join strategies that are fighting against them without changing. They can be integrated into the same opposing discourses, or different opposing discourses, of course. The nuance and complexity of ideas, categories, and language are always transforming. We should not expect studies and conversation about sex to tell us what tactics they use or what moral worldview and ideology they promote. This is another part that's important to emphasize. Public intellectuals like Jordan Peterson and others in the intellectual dark web strawman Foucault all the time by claiming that he is putting forth moral, ideological prescriptions for societies and individuals. Yet, as I've said so many times, he's descriptive, not prescriptive. He is explicitly arguing here that discourses about sex should not promote any particular strategy. Foucault is not moralizing. He's not promoting any particular ideology. He's making every possible attempt to avoid that. He is completely against people moralizing and ideologizing about sex in any way, even if someone agrees with him. Foucault is simply arguing that we should question narratives about sex in terms of the different types of knowledge and power that they produce. We should also ask what strategy and combination of interconnected factors supposedly make these discourses necessary. Foucault is just asking us to examine what effects particular conversations and so-called areas of expertise about sex have on society and why we believe we need to frame them this way. See? If you actually carefully read and spend some time studying and unpacking his writing, Foucault is a very nuanced and complex thinker. Don't let the phenomenally incorrect opinions of public intellectuals fool you. When someone mentions a book, read it and examine it yourself. Don't just take someone's word for what the author says, including me, of course. Go and read Foucault's History of Sexuality yourself. I highly recommend it. Anyway, I'll stop here for now. I know that Foucault, and keep in mind, he's so verbose that I just spent half an hour explaining this one long-ass paragraph. It's like a 2-page long paragraph. Anyway, I know that he can get extremely verbose and pedantic, of course. The fact that his writing was translated into English from French doesn't help with his obscure and abstract philosophical terms either. But I hope I did a good job of explaining Foucault's opinions. Thanks so much to everyone for watching this. And thanks to those of you who clicked the like button on this video. Share it everywhere. Hit that bell to be notified when I come up with new videos. I've got a few really podcasts with a giant big name guest coming up pretty soon that I won't say here, so it can be a surprise. Subscribe and you'll find out who it is. I've also got another podcast coming up soon with Reed Nice Wonder and Nathan, who I talked with last week about that documentary called Mighty Ira, about that former ACLU director who got famous for supporting the civil rights movement, and then later on got infamous for supporting the free speech of Nazis and their right to protest. And we were relating that to the violent insurrection and riots that happened in the Washington, D.C. Capitol, of course, recently. And I've also got another chat coming up with some of my musician friends, Dusty, Jenkins, and Chris, who are all in bands currently or have been before, on who the best frontman in rock is. So look forward to that kind of like debate and conversation about that. Anyway, also, please subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. And most of all, thanks especially to those of you who contribute to me on Patreon. You have no idea how much I appreciate that. Even $1 a month makes a huge difference to me. I'll post a link for my page in the description of this video, as I always do. So, like I always say, I love you all. Keep being the tiny beam of light that shines through the almost impenetrable darkness in the universe. And most importantly, always remember this: the funk cures all, and groove is in the heart. Also, P.S., just a little end tag here. Read History of Sexuality and Foucault's other books, of course, and think about how people seen as different, weird, or dangerous by society are put into arbitrary categories by institutions in order to be oppressed. The stigma against gay, bisexual people, and hermaphrodites has only been reduced extremely recently in the grand scope of history, of course, right? Pedophiles are still seen in a negative light, to say the least, which is, of course, totally justified in my opinion. However, while they should certainly never become accepted as those other categories of people, and I'm going to tread carefully here, perhaps our focus as a culture, our main focus, should be on preventing harm to children instead of just endlessly talking about how evil pedophiles are. There are almost guaranteed to be some who never harm children. Perhaps we should try to understand that, like gay people, they may not have any control over who they are sexually attracted to. Again, maybe the focus should just be on preventing harm to children rather than ideas like sterilizing and imprisoning pedophiles for their fucked up thoughts. Acting on those dark urges is what makes someone a reprehensible person, in my opinion. The thoughts don't do anything until they act on them. But again, like I said, I'm sure as fuck not justifying pedophilia, okay? It's really fucked up. I just think we should be able to analyze it in a fair way. Okay? Anyway, soapbox rant that will almost inevitably be misinterpreted and piss people off aside. Adios until next time, everyone.